In the list of the great Ukrainians, he took the lead over Vladimir Monomakh and Knyaginya Olga, Khrushchev and Brezhnev, Simonenko and Yanukovych. Nowadays, he is seen as the leader of the peasant revolt. They compare him to Stepan Razin, Emelian Pugachev. Che Gevara thought of him as his teacher. Nestor Makhno struggled against any power, whether it were Germans or Austrians, white or red. The only thing he appreciated was freedom, and he accomplished the near impossible. He created an ideal model of a state without power. Nestor Makhno created a new world in the center of Ukraine, an ideal state which had all the necessary attributes: its territory, its own army, its own banner, even its own money. Here are their 100 karbovanets. It is written on it, "Gop kum, do not be sad, Makhno's got money." This state also had its own capital, the town of Huliaipole, or Makhnograd. During the Civil War, he commanded an army of 50,000. Lenin and Trotsky asked for his support. Petliura and Shoropadsky tried to win him over. Denikin and Wrangel were afraid of him. It was later on that the Bolsheviks' propaganda made a bandit, a drunk and a reveler out of him. This stereotype of a ludicrous and silly monster has involved several generations of Soviet people. But this is not all. Few people know that Vladimir Vysotsky dreamt of performing Makhno in a film. With the help of his powerful friends, he obtained the memoirs of the Ataman himself and his wife's diary from the closed archives. And then he suddenly refused to play the role. It was a caricature and had nothing in common with the real Nestor Makhno, who had impressed Vysotsky. He saw the legendary Ataman not as a cruel bandit, but as a desperate dreamer and a talented actor. The life of Nestor Makhno was that of a showman full of disguises, tricks, and a multitude of roles. He was a terrorist and a prisoner, a prom trotter and an abandoned husband, a father for thousands of peasants and a lonely exile, and even a bride at a wedding. He performed each of his roles passionately and selflessly, but the ending of this fascinating play turned out to be tragic and inglorious. During the christening of this child, the priest's cassock caught fire. Although it was an accident, the congregation thought it a bad omen. And this increased the rumors that a robber had been born into the farm laborer Makhno's family. The people were right. He was the fifth child in his family. His father died a year after his birth. This is the way Nestor Makhno remembered his childhood. We were 5 brothers orphans, one smaller than the others, left to our poor mother, who had neither a house nor a home. I can dimly remember my early childhood deprived of fun and games, darkened by extreme need and deprivation. Our family suffered until the boys were able to find their feet and begin earning a living. When Nestor was 5, he began to work as a herdsboy. When his elder brothers got a job at the factory and the misery subsided, their mother sent Nestor to school. It is there that the character of the future Ataman anarchist became apparent. Restless and fretful, he could not and did not want to obey the school rules. He didn't listen to his teachers, laughed openly at the diligent pupils. He was a restless child. He only managed 1.5 years of school. 1.5. He finished first grade and was expelled during the second one. But he kept coming back to throw stones at the windows. His mother was driven to despair. Her son will remain illiterate. She couldn't have believed that several years later, Nestor would read the whole of Russian classical literature. He will study the works of the outstanding classics of anarchism and be interested in political economy. From the age of 10 to 15, Makhno managed to work for several landowners in Huliaipole. They treated the farm laborers like animals. They were often humiliated. They would lash the laborers even for small faults. Nestor could not bear it and began to avenge for the offences. He burnt down one of the landowners' houses. He fed broken glass to the pigs of another landowner. It is incredible, but nobody has ever reported him. They only whispered behind his back, "Rioter, juvenile robber, there will be no good from all of this." But Nestor was proud of this fame. Later, he began to avenge not only for himself, but also for others, for the farm laborers like him. It was the first role of his life, the people's avenger. The teenager was carried away. The thin and short boy felt like a giant. But the main thing was his stare. 10 years later, this stare alone was enough to lead thousands of people. This is the way one of his contemporaries described him. Short, thin, with a woman's face and black, longish hair. But his cold grey eyes were mesmerizing. They hypnotized everybody and made them obey his will. Nestor is 16. He's got a job at the brass factory where his elder brothers were working. Every Sunday, after having got his salary, the young man went to the nearest tavern with the other workers. And there, being drunk on cheap wine, he recounted his feats. When Nestor imitated the scared landowners, the workers burst into laughter. "You are an artist. You must work in the theatre." The young man began to believe in his talent. Nestor Makhno will write in his autobiography that he wanted to make people laugh. That's why he joined an amateur theatre circle at the same brass factory he was working at. In 3 years, Nestor took part in lots of different performances. But because of his small height, he often had to perform as women and children, but he felt he was able to do so much more. In the meantime, a real-life drama has been developing in Russia. It was 1905. The ideas of revolution, socialism, and anarchism floated in the air. Everybody was interested in politics, including the workers of the Huliaipole factory. The theatre rehearsals became an ideal disguise for political meetings. And though with time the theatre was forgotten, Nestor obtained the role he was dreaming of. He became a member of the anarchist terrorist organization called Poor Grain Growers Union. The essence of the role was pretty simple: to not allow rich men to live a quiet life and take their money away in favor of the future revolution. It turned out to be much more interesting than a theatrical performance, and it was another way to avenge the oppressing landowners, and not just for himself, but in the name of the future revolution. In 1906, the strangers burst through the door into the Huliaipole landowner Krieger's house. They were disguised with theatre masks and extorted money. The scared landowner gave the robbers all he had. But after they'd left, he called the police. The pursuit of the armed actors had begun, and they killed the court officer and several policemen in a firefight. In 1909, it was revealed that the Poor Grain Growers Union had committed dozens of robberies and several murders. Some of the underground artists, including Nestor, were arrested. The gibbet was in store for them. Next, The anarchist terrorist exchanges Stolypin's tie for Butyrka's irons. The fatal error of the Premier Minister of the Russian Empire. The prison universities of Nestor Makhno, and how Butyrka's lever became a good catch. 1909, Butyrskaya prison. It is already 2 months, and Nestor is straining his ears to every rustle behind the door. He is waiting. The door is going to open, and he will be called out and led to the gibbet. But the unthinkable happened. His sentence was changed to life imprisonment. An error in his birth certificate saved him, stating he was 20 and not 21. So, he was a minor. Ironically, the clemency of Nestor Makhno was signed by the Prime Minister of the Russian Empire, Petr Stolypin. Hundreds of members of underground organizations all over the country were executed to his order every day. 2 years later, in the same place, in Kiev Opera Theatre, Stolypin would be killed by a revolutionary. Extremely bad behavior. This inscription in Butyrka's prison register was the beginning of prisoner Nestor Makhno's new career. He did not want to die. He was afraid of death, but the fortune kept him alive. The young man realized that death was better than prison. The prison bars, the order, the irons on his legs, the arrogant warders were all driving Nestor mad. He rebelled as best he could. He refused food and threw his skilly at the warders. Once he wound up in a cell, became ill with pneumonia, and was at death's door for several weeks. Everything changed when Petr Arshinov became Makhno's neighbor. Being an experienced anarchist and terrorist, well acquainted with Bakunin, he took it upon himself to educate his young colleague from Huliaipole. At first, Nestor, who hated authority, was irritated. But over time, he began to listen to his words. Influenced by the anarchist, Makhno was reading and studying a lot. In Butyrka, the village boy learned grammar, political economy, and history. He acquainted himself with the works of the classics of anarchism, Kropotkin and Bakunin. And there he decided that any power was evil. People can take care of themselves. The revolution will help him to create an ideal world. As a consequence of the February Revolution of 1917, the Tsar was dethroned and the temporary government granted an amnesty. Thousands of prisoners were set free. The famous legendary prisoners were among them, including Grigory Kotovsky, Ataman Grigoriev, Mishka Yaponchik, and a small, unremarkable fellow, spent and pale, but with raised head and sparkling eyes, Nestor Makhno. He came back to his native town, Huliaipole. A new life and a new role were waiting for him there. A leading role this time. Nestor was received in his native land with honor, a professional revolutionary. He has built the scaffold for his ideas, served his time in Tsarist prison. Makhno basked in glory. He brought together several hundred of his fellow villagers for a meeting. Nestor was well grounded in theory, an actor with a God-given talent, and he manipulated them with elegance and a theatrical swagger. This was Makhno, who was in Butyrka with the political prisoners. He's learned the revolutionary basics, studied history, and he already knew how to promote himself. His passionate speech amazed the peasants. To their principal question, what is to happen to the land? Nestor answered, the land belongs to the peasants. Incredible. Half a year before the October Revolution, it was only a slogan, but for Makhno, it was a real business. Peasants followed him like children follow a father. Makhno formed an anarchist unit from the peasants and called it the Black Hundred. His banner and symbol frightened people. A skull and crossbones on a black piece of cloth with an inscription, freedom or death. Together with his unit, he has disbanded the public committee and the police. Then he's taken the land away from the church, the landowners, and the German colonists, and created the free agricultural communes. The 30-year-old Nestor was surrounded by fame and respect. Women began to notice him. They suddenly discerned a real defender in the small, effeminate man. The reigning beauties struggled for his attention. But the ardent revolutionary has chosen an unremarkable girl from a modest family. Her name was Nastya Vasetskaya. Their wedding celebrations lasted for a week. Makhno was happily in love. But if he could have seen into the future, he would have immediately sent Nastya back to her parents. After the wedding, his family life was idyllic. The loving wife always welcomed the tired Nestor on the doorstep. She tried to calm him, to distract him from his affairs. When he was with her, he could forget about his troubles. He was simply a loved husband. Nastya was the ideal wife. For Nastya, the main things were the family and the children, and to wait for a husband who would earn money and feed the family. Those were her only wishes. At the beginning of 1918, the armies of political enemies tore through Ukraine. It was the First World War, and the Civil War had started. The Petlura's soldiers, the white, the red, the armies of Hetman Skoropadsky, the Germans and the Austrians, and also a lot of bands and small groups of robbers, they all acted in the same way. They occupied towns and villages, organized meetings, and then robbed the population and ran away, because they were their enemies who had advanced from the other side. According to the terms of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Germany obtained the Ukraine. In April 19, the Germans came to Huliaipole. Nestor was crying. He had recently had a son. He knows what it is to be a father in the literal sense. He was performing his role for the first time in his life and was enjoying it. He was happy. He had everything: respect, popularity, money, a loving wife, and above all, he had his son. And then the occupiers came to his native land. Nestor organized an urgent meeting of the council and called for mobilization. He promised the peasants that if they dislodged the Germans from Huliaipole, they could return to their farms. It was spring and therefore time to sow the crops. But if they do not banish the Germans, all the crops will go to the occupiers. At the same meeting, he presented his invention to cheers of approval. Once, Makhno put springs on a German carriage wheels. This made the carriage run smoothly. A brilliant idea came to Nestor. What if they could mount a Maxim machine gun on a carriage like that? Nestor Makhno's machine gun cart combines two in one. It was a fast and smooth vehicle, but also an effective weapon. Due to the machine gun cart, the anarchist army moved with record speed for that time, 35 kilometers per hour, and shooting down any persecutors at the same time. Makhno was satisfied with his invention. His son will be proud of his father when he grows up. But Nestor was wrong. He will never be able to recount it to his son. Later, Makhno will vainly try and prove to the emigrants that it was him who invented the machine gun carts and not the Red Army, who later took credit for his invention. Makhno managed to gather 3,000 peasants under his banners. After several days of violent fighting, the Germans were dislodged from Huliaipole. Makhno's soldiers hardly had the time to recover. After their defeat, the Germans began to draw up the forces of their allies, the Austrians, in order to set out against the father from the west. There was an army of 20,000 of Denikin's soldiers in the east. The forces were not equal. They had to seek help immediately. Makhno had to leave his house in a hurry and ordered Nastia to be courageous and wait for him. He returned to this moment many times in his mind. There was a possibility to change it all. He could have taken them with him. He could have defended them. But at the time, it seemed too risky. The ataman was secretly hiding in towns and villages, and then he went to Moscow. There, he connected with the anarchist Kropotkin, who sent Makhno to the Bolsheviks. That is how the dynamic revolutionary from Huliaipole met Vladimir Lenin. What were Nestor Makhno and Lenin talking about? We cannot answer this question for sure. The only documented witness of this meeting is the reminiscences of Nestor Makhno himself. But all the historians suppose that at that time the Bolsheviks decided to make him an ally. They gave him an important task: to raise an army to struggle with Hetman Skoropadsky and the German occupiers. All the subsequent steps of Makhno testify that he has made a collusion with the Bolsheviks. They have helped him to get illegally into the Ukraine. There was a clear ideological story. The Bolsheviks are struggling for the working people, and you, Makhno, you are struggling for the working people. Are we brothers? Yes, we are. The Bolsheviks bolstered the agreement with several trainloads of rifles and machine guns, and also with guarantees that together they will create a bright future. But their vision of this future turned out to be different. Makhno realized this too late, after he had cleared the way to the Ukraine for the Bolsheviks. Makhno was inspired by the Bolsheviks and hastened to his home, to his beloved wife Nastia. He imagined himself taking his little son in his arms. But when Makhno came back to Huliaipole, he only found a burnt-out house. A triple grief was waiting for him at home. His brother Yemelian was executed, his son had died, and his wife had disappeared. He was overcome with pain and anger. He questioned the neighbors, but they swore they had seen nothing. His wife and son had disappeared without a trace. How could this happen? Today, the historians suggest two versions. Perhaps the wife and the son of Makhno have been stolen by the Germans or by Denikin's soldiers, the first in order to take vengeance on the father, the second to blackmail him. The second version is that they were Makhno's comrades in arms. Some of them thought that Makhno was too devoted to his family. Nastia and his son were diverting him from his public activities and political struggle. That's why they simply removed them, or perhaps deported them, and even killed them. But Nestor could not accept anything of the kind. He had too much confidence in his closest circle. Makhno was sure that it was the enemies who had done that, the same ones who had encircled Huliaipole, who were robbing and killing the peasants and not letting them work on their land. He became a monster. He was seized again by his desire for vengeance. It didn't matter who. He was surrounded by enemies. Blood was flowing like water. There was a complete bacchanal. The new Nestor, the Avenger, joined it as an equal. He acted according to the laws of that cruel time, but the methods of his war were different from the others. Those were the grandiose theater performances. Coming next, the tactical ruses of Nestor Makhno. Why did the ataman become a woman? Note that Makhno was a small, thin boy with thin arms. Why would he not use them? He put makeup on and wore his hair long. A sensational operation. How did the unit of Nestor Makhno manage to take Yekaterinoslav with the help of a cabbage? Mother Galina. How the ataman became a prom trotter. This unprecedented and daring operation was carried out in summer 1918. a wedding crowd ran into Austrian staff in a village not far from Huliaipole. The tipsy bride kissed the guardians and offered them a glass. "Drink to my health." But suddenly, the Austrians froze in terror. An unshaven chin peeped out through the wedding veil. Someone had guessed and cried out, "These are Makhno's soldiers." But it was too late. The bride drew a revolver with lightning speed, and a moment later, not a living soul was left. The wedding crowd had disappeared. If Suvorov succeeded by dint of his ability and not of number, then Makhno had the advantage of ruse, a popular ruse, and of his good acting. His disguise worked every time. That's why Makhno performed with great pleasure and excitement the roles of rough peasant women, delicate girls, or old women. With the lapse of time, his unit was armed to the teeth with German and Austrian rifles, machine guns, and sawn-off guns. People continued to arrive. The peasants knew what it felt like to be under the white, the Austrians or the Germans. They made their choice in favor of Father Makhno. When Ataman ordered to divide the army into hundreds and count it, there were about 700. That is, 7,000 soldiers. The army was rather skillfully assigned to the brigades. The cavalry units headed by the commanders, and the soldiers obeyed the laws. All of them were counted and registered. So the soldiers under the black banners became a real army. At the same time, the Bolsheviks remembered the agreement they made in Moscow. They asked Makhno to help them liberate Yekaterinoslav from Denikin soldiers. It was not an easy task. Several thousand white guards established themselves firmly in Dnipropetrovsk. All the exits of the city were under control, and Makhno played another grandiose performance. It was market day in Yekaterinoslav, the future Dnipropetrovsk. The town was crowded with peasants and their carts full of cabbage. The trade was in full swing. But suddenly, on an invisible signal, the cabbages started falling from the carts, at the same time revealing machine guns. The peaceful peasants, who in reality were Makhno's soldiers, opened fire at the Denikin staff and at the officers' hotel. They destroyed the whites. Makhno's soldiers have occupied Yekaterinoslav. They were followed by the Bolsheviks and other allies, particularly the Ataman Grigoriev, whose soldiers have carried out the massacres, robberies, and riotings in town. Later, these deeds were imputed to Makhno's soldiers. In 1918, having taken Yekaterinoslav, Makhno proclaimed, "In the name of the partisans of all the regiments, I declare that no robbery, brigandage, or violence will ever be tolerated under my leadership of the revolution, and will be nipped in the bud by me." The Black Guard of the Father was growing every day. There were already 50,000 well-armed soldiers. Nestor Makhno became self-confident and strong and did not admit any laws. He established his own rules on the occupied territories. He liberated all the prisoners from the prisons. He executed the white officers without remorse. And to the private soldiers, he gave money, vodka, and set them free. Makhno has never killed any prisoners. My grandmother remembered his words, excuse my language, "Sons of bitches, those who are with me, you go right, and those who are not with me, you take out your shoes and go fly a kite." He was speaking Russian. In autumn 1918, the Bolsheviks turned to Nestor for the second time. They planned to join their efforts against Petlura's army. And just then, during one of the battles, Makhno met a woman who amazed him. This was Marusia Nikiforova, the legendary woman of the Ataman, the terrorist who took hundreds of lives. Makhno had never met a woman like her. Marusia drank vodka, smoked, and was able to pin down any man. She was 30, but she had spent 10 years in a forced labor camp for murders and robberies. She had also finished an officer school in Paris and worked in sculptor Rodin's studio. Just like him, Marusia was in love with the revolution. And that's why this woman became his true comrade in arms. They were considered to be not only war allies, but lovers. If they really had been intimate, Nestor Makhno must have been shocked. Because in Marusia's lifetime, it was rumored that she was a man. And after her death, it turned out that the woman was a hermaphrodite. Probably this was one of the reasons for their rupture. Another reason was the political contradictions. Marusia blamed Nestor for his liberal attitude towards the Bolsheviks. She tried to prevent him from joining them and to set out against them. But Nestor still believed in the Union at that time. That's why Marusia disappeared from his life forever. Only later, Makhno understood that Marusia was right. Petliura was repelled. Nestor thought his duty towards the Bolsheviks was complete. He turned his army back home to Huliaipole. People returned to peaceful labor with joy. Some of them got a job at the factory. Most went back to the land. He tried to set an example to his citizens. Hundreds of women idolized him. They were ready to fall into his arms after one word. But soon, the relations of Makhno with all his lovers ceased. The ataman got married for the second time. But it was her who did what Nastia and Marusia could not do. They called her mother in the army, and Father Makhno listened to all her counsels. She became his second self, and Nestor invited Galina to live in his family house. But Makhno will remember with pain and shame that their first meeting nearly turned into a tragedy. Once, Nestor came to a high school library. He ordered a book which he had been reading in Butyrka, but the teacher disappointed Makhno. She said that the book was too rare and could not be handled. But the father was not used to refusals. He insisted. And finally, the young teacher yielded. But she threw the book on the floor. Nestor became angry. Icily, he ordered her to pick up the book. And when she refused, he drew his revolver. This house is the former Huliaipole High School, and this is the place where Makhno met the rebellious teacher Galina Kuzmenko. Any other woman would have been scared to death in such a situation, but she was not. The teacher looked calmly into his eyes and said, "The famous leader of the rebels should not threaten a peaceful, unarmed woman." In response to that, Makhno put away the revolver and left the school, slamming the door behind him. But he could not get the rebellious teacher out of his head. Nastia had charmed him with her woman's modesty and gentle kindness. He was exhausted after the forced labor camp and needed the warmth and the comfort of home. But the father had changed. The war had hardened him. It made him firm and independent. He could not stand any violence towards him. And that's why he valued Galina's rebellious and proud character. She was exactly the woman he needed, a companion and a counselor strong enough to help him carry his load. There were a lot of struggles ahead, and Galina didn't disappoint Nestor. It was hard to believe that she had finished a seminary and was a nun for 1 year. Several months after their wedding, the young and beautiful wife of Makhno participated in all the battles and learned to shoot a machine gun. She controlled the discipline in the army. She even killed with her own hands 2 of Makhno's soldiers for raping a woman. With time, Galina was as well respected as Makhno. They obeyed her and called her Mother. At the time, she could not have guessed the price she would pay for being the ataman's wife. Coming next, the 14th bullet for Nestor Makhno. Who managed to outwit the leader of the anarchists, and what trap was waiting for his unit in Crimea? Why did the ataman have to flee the country at the height of his fame? And why was his only daughter born in prison? In spring 1919, the All-Ukrainian Congress of Soviets resolved that the land will be passed over to the proletarian state. The commissars came to Huliaipole and proclaimed the surplus appropriation system. They were met with hostility. Nestor made a speech. If our comrades, the Bolsheviks, come from the Great Russia to the Ukraine in order to help us in our struggle with the counter-revolution, we must say to them, welcome, our dear friends. And if they come here with the aim to monopolize the Ukraine, we say to them, hands off. The Council of Huliaipole was firmly defending the independence of the Republic. Makhno's soldiers were refusing to pay tax and forcing the Bolsheviks' deputy commissars to Moscow. In October 1920, Makhno trusted the Bolsheviks for the last time. They promised him to liberate his confederates from the prison and even to recognize the autonomy of the Huliaipole Republic. He had to help them remove Wrangel from the Crimea. Makhno did not suspect that this agreement was only a bluff and that the Crimea was a big trap. He entered the Crimea with his army. He dislodged the Baron Wrangel's army, and the trap was set. His army was encircled by the Bolsheviks, who killed all the commanders and disarmed the soldiers. Only 77 of his 20,000 soldiers survived. They escaped the Bolsheviks' pursuit. They abandoned their banners and machine gun carts, but they lost their ataman. Nestor Makhno was lying on the ground. The bullet struck him in the neck, passed through, and came out his cheek. This was the 14th and his most dangerous injury. The terrible events remained as a scar on his face. Only his wife and several devoted friends were near him. They carried the seriously injured ataman over the border into Romania. He never returned home to Huliaipole. Romania, Poland, Germany. Misunderstandings were arising everywhere. They tried to hand him over to the Bolsheviks or accused him of collaboration with them. Nestor did not try to prove them wrong. He didn't care about his future. The Bolsheviks' betrayal unsettled the ataman. He was exhausted and embarrassed. When I read the reminiscences, I could feel how grieved he was. He was so close to his goal. But he could not see the power of the enemy or the meanness of the enemy. At that terrible time, Nestor Makhno became a father. The only daughter of the anarchist was born in a Polish prison, and it was that child who gave him an incentive to live. He must leave, struggle, and try to come back. In order to protect his daughter from the possible persecutions, Nestor changed her surname to Makhno, but that didn't help her much. He loved his daughter very much. Of course, she was his only child. He understood that it was unlikely that he would have another child. Perhaps he was sorry that it was not a son and that his surname would be lost. Paris, 1924. A tiny room in which it was hard for a sick man, a tired woman, and a little baby to move. This was the last shelter of the anarchist leader. the legendary Nestor Makhno. He was grateful to this room and to his anarchist friends for his rescue. It was them who organized his escape from the Polish prison. Galina had always dreamt of living in Paris. But living in the city of her dreams brought her no joy. The former queen of the steppes had to work as a laundress, a babysitter, and a cleaner. From Galina Kuzmenko's diary: apathy, indifference to everything in the world, physical and mental weakness. Oh, what a humdrum life. For the first time in his life, Nestor obediently tolerated the reproaches and the offenses. And this annoyed the tired and desperate woman even more. There was no trace left from the ardent and freedom-loving ataman she used to be proud of. Finally, Galina made her decision. One day, she simply packed her belongings, took their daughter, and left. Nestor was left alone. He was 40. He kept going with the help of casual work, and in the evenings, he was writing a book of reminiscences. His only joy was his little daughter Lenochka. During their short meetings, he was telling the girl a story. The same one every time. About the magic country Huliaipole. About the boundless steppes and the irrepressible horses. About a state without power. And about the hard-working, cheery people who make all the decisions together. The daughter barely understood her father. She was only taught to speak French. On July the 6th, 1934, the world's press announced the death of the legendary anarchist Nestor Makhno. He was buried near the Communards' grave at the Paris cemetery Père Lachaise. Before his death, the ataman said to Lenochka, "Maybe now at last you will be happy." But it wasn't to be. During the war, Yelena and her mother were deported from occupied Paris to Germany and into forced labor. They were liberated by the Soviet army. Galina naively hoped that after many years, they might have forgotten the ataman Makhno, all the more because they had an official divorce. She did not hide anything from the astute authorities, and she got 8 years in the forced labor camps and exile. Yelena got 5. After the exile, the daughter and mother settled in Kazakhstan. And only in 1976, before her death, Galina Kuzmenko came back to Huliaipole. But her visit scared their friends and family. Now she was no longer the mother, but the wife of an enemy of the people. After her visit to Huliaipole, Galina Kuzmenko lived several more years. She died quietly in Kazakhstan. Her daughter Yelena died in 1992. Just before her death, she and her mother were rehabilitated. Makhno was not an angel. He punished his enemies cruelly. But he did that not for worldwide fame, but for world revolution. He needed peace and order, free from power.